Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Maddison and David Sharrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. Good to see you again.
Peter, excellent to see you. Excellent to catch up. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think we've wrung out the sort of wrinkles in it, and we have many more things to discuss. We were going to chat about, well, these context and prompt engineering roles that are beginning to pop up in so many organizations.
Yeah, and I think this is a part of a larger conversation around, okay, well, we've got all these people and they do all of these things, but AI has significantly changed the way that stuff gets done. I mean, stuff as in building technical systems, managing, governing technical systems, building products, designing products. All of this is being thrown into upheaval by the introduction of AI. And if we start to drill down, like what happens to the people who are doing this and the skills that they have, and where do they fit into the overarching system of building a product? So let's get started.
Well, let's put some context in there. And I'm realizing I shouldn't have used that word given the conversation where we're going to go, but maybe some of the assumptions behind it. So we've had guests on the podcast. We've talked a lot about lots of different areas that AI is enabling different organizations to do different things. And I think what we're really focused on here is you're a building product, and you're beginning to use these AI tools to actually do a lot of the heavy lifting in that building process. So it's really about how to build code, build product using these AI.
Yes. And so one of the where we started this was this concept that had come up of like, where do the product owners and product managers fit into that new world? Yeah. And I threw out this idea that, well, there's this thing called context engineering that everyone's talking about. And you said, that doesn't sound right. Like the product managers and product owners don't do engineering. And then...
Well, and let me pull a few things out. I feel that context engineer, words matter. I mean, we really want to be descriptive in a way that helps us sort of navigate some of these things. And if you think back, we've had this conversation about lots of different things where people use the name for a role which is too generic, not descriptive enough, not clear enough, and that just leads to a lot of misalignment and misunderstanding around what's actually being talked about. And as soon as we started talking about context engineers, my mind immediately goes to engineering and technical side. And if I'm trying to bring product, customer-centric individuals into that, there's an automatic kind of barrier between an appreciation of what an engineer is and does and an appreciation of what the business and customer needs. And that's sort of, that's the definition of technology and business struggling to communicate with one another over the many years. And we're just creating a spot where that exact thing is guaranteed to happen just because we said context and engineer without clarification.
Well, hadn't you heard that like there are no more engineers?
So now everybody gets named as an engineer, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, but because this actually drives us very quickly to prompt engineering, where certainly many of the conversations I've been involved with and listening to and contributing to and so on, prompt engineers are effectively, it's becoming synonymous with a developer, but not in the sense that most of us think around prompt engineers. But the recognition is that developers are spending more and more time crafting the prompts and making sure they're asking for the right things of the coding agents that they are using to build out and do what would in the old days be development.
Yeah, but that's so 2025. I think we've gone beyond that now.
So what we're talking about now, just to put a label on it, is 2026, end of Q1. So that in 6 weeks' time,
next week,
dates this beautifully.
Yeah, it ages.
Okay, let's dig into context engineering, a little more detail there.
Here's the concept. I think we talked about this before. The concept that for agents to operate well, they need context, they need intent, they need that, and they need that. But they operate best when that's well structured. It's put together in a way that they can consume in a consistent manner, so that it's well repeatable and that they can start to operate with it. So we need that well-defined context, that intent, which is what gets fed into the system. And there's lots of key components that go into that. But to create good context for the agents to operate under. And especially at the level that you're guiding a product or a system, you need to define that context from a product perspective. So we can say that what is it we want this product to do? Who is it going to serve? What does it look like? And that helps guide the agents in what it is they're looking to build.
So if I try and put it into my sort of product management hat, let's see if I get this right. That feels to me like you're defining the value stream that we might be building a product to serve. So there's a clear understanding of that value stream that has boundaries, what it will do, what it won't do, what needs you're trying to meet on the customer side, what objectives the company is trying to achieve, what they're working on. But these are all sort of functional boundaries within which that value stream is delivering product.
Yeah, but and the wonderful thing about agents is that we can also then have the agents learn from that delivery and feed that back into the system.
So this is, and I just wanted to touch on that. There's a couple of things that come in, and we'll talk about technical stuff in a moment, but that sort of value stream definition, and I think we often think that this is sort of semi-permanent because, we've identified a target market, we know what we're trying to serve into that target market and so on. If you think credit cards and banks to some extent. What you're describing is actually this is probably not the first time, but it's one of those times where you're really seeing continuous room for improvement and sharpening up of that context. Now, it's not going to go like sprint by sprint, but your assumption that in Q1 of 2026, your context is defined and is then fixed through the rest of the year is not the case. You actually want to continually reevaluate and make sure we're optimizing on the right things, which is where that sort of context engineering kind of mindset comes in of continuous review and learning and everything that comes with that, minor modifications to tweak your context to get better and better results.
Yeah, so your context is being captured and fed. So you've got to go and get that context, that's where the sort of product type role looks sort of has some of those sorts of functions where it's going and looking at all the different places to pull that context from, gaining that understanding and then articulating it to help guide the product forward. So that capturing of that context is key because then that can be structured, and that's the engineering part of it, into a form that can be easily consumed. The part where engineering is a massively overblown term for this in some ways, although depends how far down that rabbit hole you want to go. But if the context being captured from the product side is essentially a text file that they are capturing that information into and defining it, somebody then needs to have the agent pick that up and consume it into the orchestration system. So there needs to be something that's doing that part. So there's a little bit of technical engineering that goes into that.
We're also hitting simple things, but version controlling of that context. So the reason I'm saying that, I'm just imagining of all the stakeholders coming and finding whoever is now labeled the context engineer and explaining how they're going to modify things, and it becomes that whoever shouts the loudest tweaks the context.
Well, somebody's got to be accountable and own it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So when you're describing it in that way, that feels like if without knowing anything else, we'd immediately say the product manager or product owner, that value stream owner, whatever the term is that you're using in your organization, they're a very natural fit for the context engineer, as you've described.
Yes.
Why is that not going to work if it isn't going to work?
I don't think it may very well work. I think this is also something that's very new and we're still trying to figure it out. There's a lot that goes into that needs to be understood. I mean, it could be argued that the context engineer is your business lead. I mean, we're still trying to figure out that, and it may also vary by organization and who currently does what in your organization, because, of course, one person's product owner is another person's product manager is another person's business lead, and so on and so forth, depending on which organization you're in. So there's definitely that part of it. I think that the key underlying commonality comes down to you need to have a written down, articulated description of what it is that the product is going to do so that agents can go away and build it. And not all organizations have that. A lot of the times it sits in people's heads.
That has to be a statement, which is the kind of statement of the conversation so far, because I would argue very, very few organizations have. It is, of course, in everybody's head, because this is what is our business strategy? I mean, it's really quite an interesting, like how you take your strategic plans and we break that down. We've talked about how hard it is to get intent at a strategic level down to the operational level. We're now creating, I would argue, cascading contexts coming through that will allow us to drive down what is being done in particular areas of the business. But I'd argue that's very rarely been done in
Part of
any
this,
organization bigger than a garage.
yeah, and part of the hilarity here, and I say that with quotes, is that this is exactly what your tech teams have been asking for all along.
Yes. Yeah.
You've been asking for this
Oh,
guidance
yeah.
and this
Yeah.
level of detail as to what the heck it is you want to do as a business, and you've often it's never really been clearly articulated. Well, now it kind of has to be. But also, your tech teams, arguably, if you haven't gone and fired them all yet, may have some time and cycles to help you with the articulation of that into terms that these agents can understand.
And so as we sort of work around that context engineer role, what I'm understanding from the way you're describing it is there is definitely an engineering component, a consistency, pattern base, some understanding of the structure that we expect to see engineers work within, right? So engineering as a discipline, whatever discipline of engineering, there's well understood principles and structures and so on that are used. And so there isn't that element. And the reason I'm calling that out is on the product ownership side, product management side, there are a lot of brilliant product owners who are, let's say, less structured because they're very much living in that ambiguity of client need and customer satisfaction and behavior and how all of that works, which is people driven and it's complex and it's just not something that fits a very natural, everything has to be 3 clicks from the homepage. And so do you see that as being a headache as you bring context engineering as a responsibility to the product owners and product managers?
I think what it amounts to is that software engineers are not the only ones heavily impacted by AI. And that when you start to look at the entire
Yes.
end-to-end system, it
Yeah.
impacts a lot more than just software engineers when it comes to what's necessary to actually drive an agentic system to build a solution. So,
Yeah. Well, and I'm just drawn into the whole, making decisions with uncertainty
mhm.
and being able to kind of navigate these things where one side of the conversation is wanting well defined, clear rules on, and the other side is not used to guidelines.
Well, and this is actually a part of it too, is that one of the wonders of these systems is that they can help you with that decision making
Yeah.
process, and they can help you with that ambiguity and that definition, and they can help you work through it. But though that it's not that you have to necessarily get perfect, but you have to get something that you're going to work through to create that context. There's some great skills out there that will help you through brainstorming and various other ways of just like figuring out what is it that I want, how do I turn this ambiguity into the next most feasible thing that I should do.
Now, if we just revisit the context engineering piece, we talked a little bit about engineering. On the context side, again, one of the things that I see when we're looking at that is we don't just have business context, product context, but we have what we would have called non-functional technical constraints within which we're working. But we're also working with context that is fixed, like follow particular security guidelines, NIST, whatever it might be, or data governance rules, which are hard and fast. We don't want some ambiguity around whether or not we release a birth date. And then on the other side of it, as you were just describing, there's that ambiguity that we want to support, but within boundaries in some way. Can you speak a bit more to the context side of the context engineering?
There's lots of different context that gets pulled into the system depending on which part of the system you're in as well. So but the key piece we're talking about from a product side is largely that business and customer context, like what's happening around the system. But that can also, depending on what you're building, there's so many depends on in this. But if you have a system where you've clearly defined what metrics you want to drive out of it or out of a particular change or feature, then you can tell the system to monitor for that and feed the telemetry back in and have it make decisions as to what to tweak from that. Equally, you will need still you need deterministic wrappers around all of this to monitor and manage for the pieces that are and critical. The things that we say, hey, these are absolutely required. We shouldn't rely on agents, especially if there's anything involving PII is a classic example where you're now ingesting PII into this part of the system where you weren't before. Relying entirely on an agent to do exactly what's being told to it in a markdown file somewhere in the 100,000 lines of markdown that you fed it. That's just foolish. You're almost certainly going to shoot yourself in the foot with that one. So you need you need systems around this to validate that the resulting outcome is the one that you're expecting, and that it actually isn't doing things that it shouldn't. So
I know we've talked a little bit about this before, but that's that controls layer effectively of how do you, if I think, I mean, this is all something that's in a sense been solved in that organizations already architect systems that have some sort of policing in place to make sure certain things happen. Everything from penetration testing to make sure you're not letting organize people through, but other ways of looking at data governance and data integrity and automating that in some way. And that's just making sure that what you're saying, as I understand it, is by all means define it in context, in the context documentation, but you also then have to police for it to make sure that that behavior is happening the way you expect it to.
And one of the key pieces here is because if you've defined it in context, you've defined it in the intent of what you want to see happen, you can check for it at the other end. Because you've said, I want to ensure that PII is treated like this, that no birthdays will go out without being masked or something like that. Then you can check our birthday fields, you can deterministically check to see is that true in the outcome. Because now I've got the context defined and the two can connect.
That feels as well, and I think this is where our conversation started, where context engineering sounds like it's got a pretty heavy technical expertise around it, because there's a natural now, if I define this in the context, I have to go to the other end of the pipeline, if you like, and make sure these things are being watched for. And I know there's agents that are created. So is that in the context for the agents that are policing?
I don't think it's the context engineer's responsibility to make sure that the validation of the outcome is correct. I think that resides elsewhere inside of the field, right? Because a lot to the reason that if we're going with our supposition here that it's a product role that fills the context engineer space. So they're basically doing the work of pulling that context together and creating the understanding around it and feeding it into the front end of the system. Then you probably actually don't want them to be the ones who are validating the context at the other end.
Separation of roles again, right?
Yeah. So with that, and I think we've explored this somewhat, and are there any points you'd like our audience to take away?
Yes. So what I'm learning, or one of the conversations that we just, the discussions we ended up having is the clarification of context being something that we always wanted written down, and that various organizations have attempted in various different ways to capture that. So I find it actually quite exciting to see organizations actually think about how they build products and services and what they're actually trying to capture, deliver, because so much of that is strategic conversations, the things that change, and we'd never really get that locked down. So I think one of the first things that strikes me is that there is definitely this push to something that has been a desired outcome for many years, decades, but has very rarely actually been put in place, at least in most organizations.
Yes, it's almost that structuring of intent that is needed for us to. We've talked about this a little in the past too, is that a lot of what we see coming in with these tools is actually an acceleration of transformations that we've been trying to do for years, but been very hard for people to adopt.
Anything else you'd add?
I liked that we were exploring like where that division lies, and I think it will vary by organization and what that particular organization is doing and building. Like for some organizations, your product owner is maybe more technical and has a broader insight into how some of these other pieces are done. In some organizations, it makes sense to understand this piece at the front. I think the valuable piece to take away from this is Start thinking, if you haven't already, about what context needs to be captured to guide your products, where that is being stored, who is creating it, and who is then going to be the one picking it up and moving it through the system. Start thinking about this, because good context drives better outcomes, which has always been the case, except we're now calling it that. So,
well, and maybe I'll just add one thing, which is the realization that your business and your technical teams, that conversation, pulling those two spheres of knowledge and expertise and experience closer and closer to be able to cross that, becomes more and more important.
Yes, you really can't afford to operate as the business and the IT anymore. It can't be just throwing things over the wall. You've really got to have the two groups working very, very closely, hand in hand. So, and we shouldn't forget, so if you like this conversation and you want to hear more, then hit subscribe. It's we always like new subscribers. It makes this pretty graph goes up, and Dave always seems very, very happy when the graph goes in the right direction. If you'd like to be on the show, then you can reach out at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. And yeah, look forward to next time.
Until next time, thanks again.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Maddison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.